So usually when something is published by a conservative politician about leaving the European Convention of Human Rights, my hackles go up because I tend to expect them to ignore Northern Ireland. So when I opened up Suella Braverman's new policy document on why the UK should leave the ECHR and how they should go about doing it, I expected the exact same thing. However, to my surprise, there's actually a whole section devoted to Northern Ireland and trying to explain why withdrawal from the European Convention on Human Rights is possible and won't violate the Good Friday Agreement. However, while that meant I wasn't annoyed by the fact that she'd ignored Northern Ireland, I was annoyed by the actual solutions that she's proposed and by one key thing that she's actually not mentioned throughout this document. So really, when it comes to Northern Ireland, there are two key points that Suella Braverman makes. The first one is that she says that domestic law is perfectly fine. We can replace the European Convention on Human Rights and the Human Rights Act with domestic protection of human rights. For example, classic common law system. The second point she makes is that this can be done through treaty renegotiation. So on this first point of whether the convention can merely be replaced by classic common law principles, she argues that the underlying spirit of agreement is of consent, equality and democratic legitimacy, not legal subservience to international tribunals. A UK-wide withdrawal from the ECHR can and must be consistent with these principles. The key is to ensure that rights protections remain credible, effective and applicable equally across the United Kingdom. The British people must be the source of their rights, not foreign judges. The UK has a proud history of liberty, from Magna Carta to Blackstone, from habeas corpus to the Bill of Rights 1689. Human rights should reflect our constitutional traditions and should be accountable to Parliament. Essentially saying we can trust the British common law, we can trust the British system to protect human rights. Well, if that was the case, there would have been no requirement for this inclusion of the European Convention on Human Rights in the Good Friday Agreement in the first place. The reason why it was included is precisely because one community in Northern Ireland did not actually trust the British institutions. You only need to look at some of the instances in the Troubles, certain allegations of collusion, certain instances regarding the old police force, that you can see why that trust broke down. So it was a fundamental component of the Good Friday Agreement that there is some form of international oversight. Now, this might be to the chagrin of many in the United Kingdom who think that they're nice and civilised and they never violate human rights, and violations of human rights are only for those savage countries. Nevertheless, one doesn't have to look too far into the history of Northern Ireland to see, well, actually, there's probably a lot of good reasons as to why international oversight would be necessary. So this idea that you can just trust British institutions goes completely against what a lot of the Good Friday Agreement stood for, what the Good Friday Agreement was designed to do, and Suella Braverman conveniently overlooks that. The second point she makes is that this can simply be done through renegotiation. And the document gives a list of examples in which this renegotiation had occurred before. However, I think there's a bigger question here that actually the document completely ignores, and that is the origins of the Good Friday Agreement in the first place. Now, this is not to say that she doesn't talk about it. She does talk about it, but it's interesting about what she doesn't say about the origins of the Good Friday Agreement and how it was ratified. So according to Suella Braverman, the Good Friday Agreement is a multi-party agreement between most of Northern Ireland's political parties and a British-Irish agreement which is an international treaty between the UK and Ireland. Okay, so far so good. There's nothing wrong with that. She also talks about how the agreement was a delicate balance rooted in consent. So according to this, therefore, the Good Friday Agreement is about a negotiation between political parties in Northern Ireland and also between British and Irish governments. And if you can simply get all of those to agree, then we can amend the Good Friday Agreement. But she is ignoring one key factor in the ratification of the Good Friday Agreement, and that is that on the 22nd of May 1998, two distinct referendums were held on the island of Ireland, one in Northern Ireland and one in the south. And in both of these referendums, there was a resounding yes in favour of ratifying the Good Friday Agreement. So it's quite surprising that a pro-Brexiteer like Suella Braverman, who was all in favour of giving effect to the people's will as a result of the 2016 referendum, wouldn't in fact reference the 1998 referendums held on the island of Ireland. She seems to be under the assumption that you can simply amend the Good Friday Agreement without having to have another referendum, and she doesn't see any problem with this. So in theory, because of the UK's system of parliamentary sovereignty, you could argue that no referendum is actually legally binding. But Brexit has shown us, however, that referendums are in fact politically binding. And I would go so far as to argue that very often British politicians assume that parliamentary sovereignty is synonymous with the will of the people, or that they can just assume that parliamentary sovereignty is democratic. What Brexit did was reveal a rupture between the people on one hand and those who claim to speak on their behalf on the other, i.e. Parliament. What's fascinating about Suella Braverman's document is that although she doesn't refer to the referendum on the Good Friday Agreement, she refers repeatedly to the Brexit referendum. In fact, it's this Brexit referendum and giving effect to the will of the people in that referendum that seems to animate quite a lot of this document. For example, she seems to take quite a lot of offence to the fact that Northern Ireland would be treated as somewhat distinct from the rest of the UK when trying to implement Brexit. So for her, Northern Ireland can't be treated differently. Except Northern Ireland is treated differently. It's treated differently all the time. It's treated as a place apart. In fact, it's treated as a place apart in British constitutional narratives. British constitutional narratives never seem to mention Ireland, never seem to mention Northern Ireland when they talk about this amazing record of human rights that they have. You basically need to ignore almost the entirety of Irish history, the entirety of Northern Ireland prior to the Good Friday Agreement. You basically need to avoid thinking about the British Empire. So this emphasis on Brexit is very often conceptualised as the need to give effect to the will of the people. Well, if that's the case, why are you ignoring the will of the Irish people in the Good Friday Agreement? If you want to change the Good Friday Agreement, at least to this extent, when we're talking about removal of a significant component, for example, the European Convention on Human Rights, I would argue that politically speaking, in order to do so, you need a referendum. And it is most likely that any renegotiation between the respective parties, that one group would insist upon a referendum. Now, if no agreement is possible, and if the UK wishes to go ahead and unilaterally change the Good Friday Agreement, well, you would have a violation of international law in that regard. Certainly you could make the argument that that would be perfectly legal domestically because Parliament is sovereign. However, then you're in the situation of basically saying that it's perfectly fine for a sovereign Parliament to overrule the will of the people. And this was an argument that Suella Braverman was very much against when it came to Brexit. So really, when you read this document, I think it's important to pay attention to what she doesn't say rather than what she does say. And what she doesn't say is that a referendum was required to ratify the Good Friday Agreement. And I would argue such a referendum would be required to change it again to such an extent. And if someone is to insist that Parliament is sovereign and can at least change the law domestically, unilaterally, without a referendum, well then to that person I would question what their perspective was on Brexit. Why does the view of the British people as a whole matter, but the view of Northern Irish people and the view of Ireland as a whole, given that the Good Friday Agreement was ratified by 2 referendums, why does that view not matter? And I would also argue that you're going to be fighting a losing battle if you are to attempt to try and renegotiate the Good Friday Agreement to that effect, to remove references to the European Convention on Human Rights. And so then what you're going to be left with really is for Parliament to just come along and unilaterally decide that we're changing the Good Friday Agreement, or at least its domestic effect, in this way, and removing references to the European Convention on Human Rights. And I think it reveals a lot about the strategic ways in which people use referendums, the strategic ways in which people invoke the will of the people in the UK Constitution. It's the will of the people that is expressed in a referendum on the one hand, but then it's the will of Parliament, and Parliament is sovereign on the other. We saw how those competing perspectives arose in the context of Brexit, and we saw what side of that debate Suella Braverman was on at the time. If she's consistent, she would insist on a referendum, and she would insist on respecting the outcome of such a referendum too.